I'm George Galloway, and I present Kalima Horra on Al Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. Kalima Horra means free word. That's what I speak. So Kalima Horra is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Al Mayadeen television. Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen television, coming to you from London and talking, unusually, about Britain, about the British Conservative Party, the ruling party since 2010, indeed the ruling party throughout most of Britain's democratic history. And in particular, that governing party's attitude to Muslims and to Islam. Now, everybody in Britain knows that under Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour Party was supposedly rife with anti-Semitism. For the most part, in fact, that meant there was growing support for the Palestinian people in the Israel-Palestine conflict, but never mind. That was neatly and devastatingly conflated into the false charge, in my view, largely, of anti-Semitism within Labour. Virtually nobody knows that many Muslims in the Conservative Party and many Muslim organisations believe that the ruling party, the Conservatives, are bitterly riven with anti-Muslim prejudice. Is it true or is it not true? What does it even mean? Why would any Muslim join the Conservative Party anyway in the first place? That's a question I certainly would ask. To wonder if the Conservative Party dislikes Muslims is to have arrived from a distant planet. The British Conservative Party represents the ruling imperial ideology in Britain. Why would it like foreigners of any kind, never mind Muslim foreigners, who insist on their distinctive ways and their cultural norms? Boris Johnson, the leader of the Conservative Party at the time of recording and the Prime Minister of Britain, has written horrific things about Muslims and actually about Jews in his fictional work, but also in his factual, and I put that in quotation marks, journalism. He described Muslim women wearing the full burqa as looking like walking letterboxes, for example. He also said that black people had lower intelligence than white people, though he's just apologised for that, only several years after he said it. So why would any party, led by Boris Johnson, be imagined to be a party that would give a fair crack of the whip to Muslims? And yet, as Muslims go up in the socio-economic ladder in Britain, build businesses, become wealthy, in some cases vastly wealthy, perhaps they're only expressing their class interests or putting their class interests first. But they have argued that they don't get a fair share of seats to fight for Parliament, of peerages into the House of Lords, or even just of basic respect. We hear this word now bobbing around, Islamophobia. Ahmed Thomson is a barrister and an Islamic scholar. So who better to ask for a definition of Islamophobia? Ahmed.
Well, it's interesting because it doesn't come from the Quran. You know, there isn't a word in the Quran from which Islamophobia derives. And if you go into the history of the term, it's basically only about a century old. It was used by a French writer in the 20th century. And it was popularised really in 1996 when the Runnymede Trust brought out their paper called Islamophobia, A Concern for Us All. And this was the first time really that it was brought into common parlance. And it always seemed to me a bit dodgy, because it's almost like it was being used to define Muslims in the sense of being victims of some kind, that for some unknown reason, people had this irrational phobia, it's almost like a mental illness, of just hating Islam or fearing Islam or hating Muslims or fearing Muslims. And it didn't, to me, actually bear any direct connection to reality of the Muslims that I knew, certainly. So it seemed to me at the time that it was almost like a psyops, gentle psyops kind of strategy of getting the Muslims to look at themselves in a certain way where they would see themselves as victims.
And perhaps correct one or two things for the benefit of the ruling ideology.
And so it was almost like it was designed to keep people in their place. And what is interesting is that report was published by Jack Straw of the Labour Party. And
who later went on to kill rather a lot of Muslims.
Well, this is the thing. And also at the time, at that time, late 90s, early 21st century, it wasn't there wasn't any law that legislated against discrimination on the grounds of religion. And whenever the subject was brought up, he would always try and steer it away and say it's just racial prejudice, it's not religious prejudice. And that was reflected in the laws of the time, that if you were being discriminated against because you were a Muslim, that wasn't against the law. But sometimes you could get a success in court by saying it was indirect race discrimination, that if you belonged to a certain ethnic minority, then it could be indirectly allocated that label. But he always avoided using the term religious discrimination until the 1998 Human Rights Act came into law. And then it had to recognize that, yes, this is something that not only exists, but also there have to be remedies to secure compensation where people have been discriminated against on the grounds of their religion. So then the Labour Party then had to accept that. But it's almost to me that it's like a false dialectic, a false way of looking at life. And what I found is that if you go back to the Quranic terminology, you have a much more deeper look at what actually goes on inside people. And basically it comes down to people who accept and people who reject prophetic messages, prophetic guidance. And the people who reject usually give the people who accept a hard time. That's their role in creation.
Isn't this the normal contending of 100 schools of thought? I was brought up a Catholic. I could argue there is Catholic phobia still until 2021 in Britain. You can't be a Catholic and marry into the royal family, for example. If you are a Catholic, you have to give your religion up. Boris Johnson appears to have metamorphosed back into a Catholic. He's been a butterfly, a slug, now he's back as a butterfly, and he becomes the first ever Catholic Prime Minister of Britain, although he's not a great example as a Roman Catholic.
It's following the tradition of Henry VIII, isn't it?
Quite so.
Change religion so you can have a marriage.
Indeed. But isn't this, I'm entitled to be prejudiced against Catholics or Protestants or Muslims, am I not? In the sense that I can say, I don't like your religion, I don't like what it stands for. Isn't that every citizen's right in a free country?
Well, I think, yes, but you can go deeper. You can say, well, I disagree with what you say or what you teach because, for example, the doctrine of Trinity never came out of the lips of Jesus. It came along 3-4 centuries later. So it was a product of people actually changing the original teaching. And this is why I can't accept it. And also, it just doesn't match up to the world that I see around me and the universe I see around me. I don't see this kind of division.
So that's rational. So what we're talking about here is irrational prejudice.
Yeah. So you can have reasons why you... And in the end, you can say, well, we'll have to agree to disagree, for example. Because the Muslims go even further and they say, well, in fact, the Quran confirms that Jesus wasn't crucified. And if you look at the Gospel of Barnabas, it says it was actually Judas whose appearance was turned to look like Jesus, and it was he who was crucified. So he was, as it were, hoisted on his own petard, to use a kind of later phrase, but you'd use a bit of Shakespeare. But you can see there that there you can actually have rational argument where the object is to have better understanding. And you can get to the point where you say, well, I don't agree with you, and we'll have to agree to disagree because I'm sticking to what I believe. But when you say you're different to me and therefore you need to be annihilated,
of course, that's
when you.
That's not really. That's much more than prejudice.
Yeah.
But for example, if I was playing devil's advocate here, and I'm the leader of the Conservative Party, am I not entitled to say that actually I don't want more Muslim members of Parliament because I don't think that's where the Conservative Party stands?
Well, I think the thing is, you see that the main parties, most people, when the election comes, they're faced really with choosing the lesser of the evils that are available, not that they actually believe.
Well, as a candidate in an election at the moment, I'm hoping that the people will do that.
And therefore, they tend to not vote for the party often, but for the person. They say, well, this person, is sincere, or this person has beliefs that I agree with. He is against discriminating on grounds of race and religion, for example. And for that reason, I will vote for him or her, not because I believe in the manifesto of the party, but because I believe that person may do some good, do more good than the other candidates.
Azam.
But I think all of the parties actually try and get as many people to vote for them as possible. And therefore, they're trying to be
all things
as inclusive as possible. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And women, we should say. Ali Azam, you're the co-founder of the Virtue Ethics Foundation based in the United Kingdom. And you have said we have witnessed extreme to passive opinions regarding Islamophobia, and you throw in the LGBTQ plus community. Are these things comparable?
They're comparable to the extent that if we are going to look at the whole phenomenon at the very, first principles. So even though Islamophobia has different definitions, it's a contrived fear to advantage a certain group, and in this case, we're talking about conservatives. It has different meanings. There is just a hatred, dislike against a growing threat of fundamentalism or immigration or, otherness. But Islamophobia, at the very root of it, it has to be understood taking a very broader context. And I think unless that has been tackled, there is no objective, dynamic and objective addressing it. And that is that within the Muslim community, it's very prevalent that human rights is always conflated with imperialism and expansionism. Pluralism is always equated with moral equivalence. Liberalism is an antonym to Islam completely. The second and third generations who are living here, they want to demand their rights, but yet they want to refuse to sign up to the liberal democracy as such, which has British values, which should have been human values or universal values. But the denial of that or not accepting that, I think it's all feeds into it. So it's although it is argued that is oversimplification to put closed views as the reason of Islamophobia, but it plays in a great deal.
Well, let me make the same kind of point I made to Ahmed. I am myself personally opposed to the LGBTQ plus narrative in the sense that I don't want my primary school children to be taught the kind of things that they, if the teachers can get away with it, will teach them about that. Am I not entitled to that view? Why does that make me a phobe?
No, it doesn't make you a phobe, but I think that as societies construct and things move and there are more rights being recognized for all minorities, I think there is a responsibility on all communities to be able to reconcile between what they theologically hold as their beliefs and a harmonious society in which it takes a stronger character to be able to live in a society where, by rule of law, certain relationships have been, been seen to be legitimized. And you have to also see that, when two children who are brought up by two fathers or two mothers are coming to the school at a very young age, they should not be bullied against. So this,
no, of course, no one's. It's haram to evince hatred towards a child or a person, but I'm entitled to hate the ideology that the parent stands for, am I not?
You are, hate is a strong word, as, we'd all advocate being able to accept others rather than hating others. That would be just, you'd have to reconcile these.
Accept the other, yes, accept the person,
yes.
But for example, this issue of teaching, or for that matter, in the Batley Grammar School, the depiction of the Prophet Muhammad as a terrorist to school children, schools that we pay for. This is liberalism gone to its extreme, is it not?
Well, liberalism, obviously, it does go to extreme in some sense, but I think that doesn't give anybody the license to impose certain, the will of certain groups. So what you can do and what we can do collectively as a community to just bring more education, that's the only way, because if otherwise the repercussions will continue to perpetrate. So if you wanted to claim your rights, what makes you think that the other side would take it favorably? I mean, they would have their consents, and that it would just be a perpetration of negativity.
Dr. Hamid Alshejni, you're an academic expert of Arabic and international affairs and a consultant and a commentator. Where do you stand on this subject of British Islamophobia?
The problem is that happening at the time being is there are other division with regard to defining Muslims and non-Muslims. Different religions have their own way of defining their own way of life, and nobody could touch upon them, and there is laws that protect them. While Islam has become an open window for anyone to attack and the scapegoat for any politician that want to divert the problems from economics to any issues that the country has to those minorities and attack them in the open, and nobody could say no. The problem also exists within the community itself. I don't think that they are very active to represent themselves in such an aggressive way to say, look, we are integrating, we are part of the society, we should be treated equally. And the other thing is, what's making things worse is the division among the Islamic country. And they try to influence different groups within this country or different parties, i.e. find some that they pay, the Conservative Party, for example, to deport those what we call Islamists, or those that they have a different opinion or a liberal opinion from those conservative Muslims. But I usually look into the issue in a broader way. If we look at UK, the Conservative Party to start with, when it started, it was dividing the society itself. It was dividing the British society as elite and non-elite, as masters and slaves. And then it came the immigration, and then they have tried to divide the immigration among themselves and make them scapegoats, as I say, initially to all the problems that UK has. But at the end of the day, if they are trying to correct it, as an example, the Islamophobia, how they are correcting as a Conservative Party?
Well, isn't it a bit isn't a Muslim joining the Conservative Party a bit like joining a boxing club and complaining that people are hitting each other? Why would you expect anything different from the Conservative Party than racial and religious prejudice? That's what they're based on.
I'm not I don't agree that there should be a bridges within the party itself, because it's political motivated issue in here. And when you are treating different groups within the party, you are telling them get off, don't be part of it. And one of the problems that has been raised many times, there has been reporting about accusation of prejudice, hatred, discrimination, yet it wasn't recorded. And if it's recorded, it's just in a slice, in a very, very surface way that you couldn't dig it out. Even the commission that they formed to try to dig out this issue and say what's happening, they couldn't find recording on all the grassroots of the party. And the recommendation came to say, look, you should start putting some mechanism in place to tackle this issue. You should start train the party members how to coexist with others and so on and so forth. And I think if they start tackling it from the grassroots, i.e. from schooling system, because there is still exclusive schools, there is elite school, and in those schools they are still teaching the same methodology, the same mentality, the same superiority, and so on and so forth. And they come out and they become a leader easily because they follow their parents and so on and so forth. I don't think it's going to change unless they integrate those schools. They ask Muslim school, for example, to integrate, not to teach specific subject. That's fine. If you make it universal for all the other schools, for private school, in that they all have the same teaching, we are all equal, we are British. As a child, learning this to exist with others, to play with others, and so on and so forth, you're going to get rid of it. But the problem, I don't think that they are tackling it. They don't want to tackle it because the elite want to still be in control, and they use those cards to defy it in that they could conquer it at the end of the day.
Briefly, Ahmed, what do you think of that?
I think it's trying to reconcile the irreconcilable.
Irreconcilable, me too.
There is a short surah in the Quran, Surah Al-Kafirun, which can be translated as the people who cover up the truth or the people who reject. And a translation, which I've quoted actually in the House of Lords, when the committee there was considering the laws against
religious hatred.
Religious hatred. And it's very simple. It says, "O you who reject, I do not worship what you worship. And you do not worship what I worship. And I will never worship what you worship. And you will never worship what I worship. To you, your way of life. To me, my way of life." And it's a recognition of a difference between the people who reject and the people who accept. And when you look at life in these terms, of this grouping, then you will find that in all the political parties, there are people who accept and people who reject. And you will find amongst the people, for example, Sayyida Warsi, who last month spoke out against what was happening in Palestine and said, look, this is the government policy, but where is it being implemented? And so she was very brave in doing that because she knew that immediately she would be accused of being anti-Semitic and all the rest of it, all whatever happens when you look at what has been done to the people of Palestine. And I think as long as people try to say, well, we've all got to be the same, it's never going to work because we're not all the same.
Much more of this after the break. Stay tuned. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen Television, coming from London and unusually talking about London, talking about Britain, its ruling Conservative Party, and alleged Islamophobia, a fear and loathing of Muslims within the ruling British Empire. Who'd have thunk it? Let's go to Helen Buyniski, who's an American journalist and political commentator, and an investigative journalist to boot, to see what she thinks.
Thank you.
So, Helen, it's official. We've got the report. The British ruling party, the Conservatives, have a problem with what's called Islamophobia. How does that compare with the parties in the United States?
In the US, concerning Islamophobia, you may or may not be aware, there was a study that came out a few years ago showing that some 95% of terrorism cases had basically been manufactured. They were entrapped, basically, these men, most of whom were Muslim, into committing crimes by the FBI. Basically, the FBI would offer to buy them weapons or help set them up with plots. And these men who otherwise would have done nothing of the sort, anything along the lines of commit terrorism. And this has been going on since 9/11, as you mentioned earlier. It's been like the Muslims have been the boogeyman of choice in the US for going on 20 years now. And we have other boogeymen from time to time. Russia, of course, has become our favorite on the hacker side. But as far as Muslims go, it's basically an entirely manufactured narrative. It's a fairy tale, this evil enemy from without. There's always the enemy from within and the enemy from without. And in this case, this is the enemy from without. And we're told to be afraid, be very afraid, because otherwise, if you don't behave, well, then those evil Muslims are going to come and get you.
This Islamophobia, is it impacted by the rhetoric of the political leaders?
Well, it's all about divide and conquer, and Muslims are one of the largest religious populations in the world. So what we have here is they're pitting the Christians or the individuals who were Christians but are now largely lapsed in the U.S. population, although we do have a large born-again Christian population. They're basically pitting the Christians against the Muslims, and this is because the U.S. gives so much in its foreign policy to Israel. And so the Israeli nation, which considers itself the representatives of Judaism, but is not necessarily, there are plenty of Jews who object strongly to what Israel is doing foreign policy-wise. But this is basically a contest to divert attention from the real boogeyman in the room, which is Israel. And so you've got the U.S. is being asked to fight Israel's wars for it, and doing unfortunately, a very expensive and bloody job of it. And it's very unfortunate that this conflict has been generated and has been going on for so long, because the death toll is enormous. Not to mention what's happened to just America's future as a country. We have no money, our generations that are coming up now they have nothing to look forward to except more of the same. And that's a terrible thing to have.
According to a survey by the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, 62% of Muslims in the United States, including 68% of Muslim women, experience religious discrimination just in 2019. That looks like a huge number of incidents, is it?
Well, it's easy to find the group that looks different and point at them and blame them for whatever happens to be wrong. I mean, as human beings, we've been scapegoating the other for generations, going back into prehistory. But it's unfortunate, because the Muslims were not our enemies, at least foreign policy wise, until it became the thing to do Israel's battles for it. And it's unfortunate because there are so many Muslims who come to this country seeking a better life. I mean, anyone who lives in a big city knows that there are local bodega owners from Yemen, and there's all these people from Syria, and we're familiar with these people. But the problem is that in large swaths of the country, we don't have immigrants who might familiarize the average American with the average person from, say, Iran or Syria or wherever. So people, the unknown becomes the feared, and that contributed to by huge amounts of propaganda being shoveled at us, whether it's from the Israeli propaganda machine or from other propaganda machines. There are plenty of them. Of course, the homegrown propaganda machine is one of the worst. Unfortunately, you've got these born-again groups that want to blame all their problems on Muslims, when it's, like I said, the terrorism problem is a wholly manufactured one, and 95% entrapped by the FBI. That's a really bad statistic.
And finally, what's the role of the media in this ever-increasing phenomenon?
Well, it's all about hoodwinking people. I mean, whatever the agenda of the day is, you really can't trust U.S. media. They say it's independent media. We don't have state-run media like these other countries. But if you look at actually who's paying for it, I mean, you watch the commercials on CNN, and you see commercials for Lockheed Martin, a stealth bomber, or it's like nobody's sitting there buying stealth bombers. The CNN audience cannot afford these weapons of war. So it's pretty clear that the US taxpayer dollars are being funneled into the Pentagon, which then pays for favorable coverage from the media, which is not independent. Don't let anybody tell you that. It's all you gotta do is watch 5 minutes of it, and it's just rah cheering on the war machine. This is not what Americans want. This is not what any of us want. I don't think. Unfortunately, the rest of the world is able to distinguish between the American people and the American government, because otherwise we would have a serious problem on our hands.
Dr. Hamid, Helen seemed to be saying two apparently contradictory things there, that in part it is innate to other people, that we've been doing it for time immemorial, but also that it's actually the state that needs it. If you're going to be at war against Muslim countries year after year after year, you kind of have to pump up the anti-Muslim propaganda, and the uneducated will not be able to distinguish between the Muslims you're supposed to hate and the Muslim who's selling you groceries in the corner shop. Which is it, or is it both?
I think it's both to some extent, because there are like a kind of emphasis from the top that the systematic way of divide and conquer, that she referred to it, and I did previously, driving all the scenarios in the ground. Yet they know that some are not keen to challenge them, so they go to the extra miles of oppressing them more, or not caring about them, or discriminate against them within the society. And it started with even with the movie, as you could remember, in the 60s of the last century and the 70s, they all the time portrayed a Muslim as this terrorist wearing egal and going into the street killing and so on and so forth. And now they are afraid of the internal ones, i.e. the one living in the West, because they start waking up, they start challenging the system, they start saying, this is right and that's wrong, it shouldn't be done in such a way. So the easiest way is to keep trying to make a bad image of Islam.
Ali Azam, is that what it is in your view, that the Muslims are just the latest bogeymen? We've had others. Black people were once the bogeymen here, some still are. Irish people were bogeymen for a time. And communists were under our beds and so on. Is that what it is, or does Islam or Muslims bear some responsibility for how other people see them?
Well, it's both. First of all, for the question that you put before, whether it's innate. So it's really a social condition, but sociology and anthropology has only studied it within conditions and symptoms, and that's why they have borrowed a lot from critical race theory and tried to imply that it's really a kind of racism, just packed as religious. But this really is a human condition. It cannot be studied in structuralism, destructuralism, in how societies are being constructed. It's really a very innate thing of taking dominance over somebody who's weaker than you. If you were to overturn power structure, if we were to introspect that, we will see that the position would be extremely worse if that power structure was given to Muslim countries, and then what the Westerners would be inflicted with. So we could actually be introspective and see that it's really a human condition. It has to be dealt with at that level. And with Dr. Hamid, I would agree that it has to start with education. There is no other way to deal with this, because what we are, even right now, what we are discussing are only opinions. We don't have any objective understanding. We haven't gone through any dialectic to try and see, laws of contradictions. If this, stands true for this, should that stand true for this as well? So we haven't gone through any of that deconstruction of the phenomenon. And until we deconstruct the phenomenon, we are in no position to contemplate or reflect upon. So we are just it's always going to be groupism. So I will always side with my religion, my sect, my nationality against the other. It's not going to be on any objective values. To bring it to objective values, we have to transcend from some of the verse that Ahmed cited, But I think that's reductionism, because we cannot live in an alienated system. We as believers, as moral agents, need to include and bring the polarity somewhere calibrated into the middle. If we don't do that, then we're always going to have the very, right wing, which are from margins, they're going to go into the mainstream. So it's our responsibility to deal with this phenomenon head on, but with wisdom and with categorical morality, not because it suits us, not because what we're going to be put to if we don't. This is our duty, and I would say that Prophet, peace be upon him, in Islam is seen as a rahmatul alameen, the blessing for humanity. And that's only through the character that he embodied, which is not the one that you protest against, you shut down or shun other people's, but you impact by entrenching. So it's Muslims.
By good example. I mean, Muslims have a bad name sometimes for a good reason. I recently put my mother-in-law in a telephone box that was filled with obscene prostitutes' cards written in Arabic in Edgware Road, and she fled from the telephone box. This kind of horrific behavior by some Muslims. Some don't need the FBI to entrap them into terrorist acts. Some of them have committed terrorist acts with the FBI nowhere in sight, in Manchester Arena and so on. So Muslims, don't they, Ahmed, have some responsibility? If every Muslim neighbor was like you, people would have a better view of Islam, wouldn't they?
I think the thing is that you have to look at the techniques that are used by the current power status quo that are used in order to keep their status quo. A lot of that is done through the media, and a lot of it encourages people actually to take an extreme position, because then it gives a justification for what the power nexus then does to deal with this problem. So, for example, Iraq, on the face of it, was invaded after 9/11, even though Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with it, and that was on record. But in what Chaim Weizmann called the fog of war, in that fallout from the attack on the Twin Towers, on the back of that, they invaded Iraq, and in the short term it was weapons of mass destruction, and you had Colin Powell showing a kind of satellite image of a building and saying it's all been done in there, which was a load of rubbish. But it was accepted because that was the official narrative. And Tony Blair had been told, by the Attorney General, you can't invade Iraq to effect regime change. But in the end, post facto, once it was shown that there were no weapons of mass destruction, and this is why Kelly was killed, because he knew that there weren't any. He'd been there with all the weapons inspectors. He knew the story, and that's why he was killed on this alleged suicide, for which there was never a post-mortem. He shifted, after the event to say, well, Iraq is better off without Saddam Hussein. But is it? What I'm saying is if I could make the point that the techniques they use are to support extremism. Al-Qaeda was funded by America. ISIS was funded by America.
Sure.
It was all done with dollars, American dollars.
Sure. That doesn't mean it's not.
But by having the bogeyman, by building it up, you then have the excuse to go and invade the country and blow it up.
Yeah.
But if you're looking at terrorism, look at state terrorism. Look at what has been done.
Why can't we look at both?
Well, the thing is that the state definitions of terrorism exclude state terrorism. They say it can only be done by an individual or group of individuals.
Yes,
so
but I was 1 mile away from the Manchester Arena when a Libyan Muslim fanatic blew up and murdered scores of children, murdered and mutilated scores of children at a concert.
No, it's terrible. It's ghastly. It's awful that it comes to this. That someone who's obviously not right in the head does something as stupid as that and as ghastly as that. And everybody quite rightly condemns it. There's nothing to do with Islam. But what actually pushes people to that position? And you see, this is...
Well, he was pushed to that position by his handlers who extremised and fanaticized them to get rid of Gaddafi in Libya because he was at that time the enemy. Anyway, we'll come back to these points. Let's hear, though, from Caterine Shekdem, who's a writer and political analyst on the Middle East and the head of the Yemen department of England Next Century Foundation.
You're very welcome.
Well, the report shows clearly that there is a problem of Islamophobia in the ruling Conservative Party, despite their claims of zero tolerance of it. Why?
Why? It's a very good question. There's no easy answer for this. I think it has a lot to do with bigotry. I think it has been passed down, and I think I would say it's almost in the political DNA now of the Conservative Party. And this is not to say I'm not trying to pass judgment on the Conservative Party at all, or their politics. What I'm saying is that there's a certain behaviour, there's a pattern that sadly we haven't been able to break away from when it comes to Islamophobia. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that we haven't understood the problem that pertains to Islamic terrorism versus Islam and Muslims in general. And so because it's easier to just, brush people under one color and just to say, well, Islam is bad, or, all Muslims are a certain way. I think it has allowed, for this, for Islamophobia to actually kind of anchor itself within the Conservative Party's narrative. And I think it has to do with a little bit of populism and demagoguery, in the sense that they're trying to address a certain audience and cater to their fear and give the impression that they are actually acting on behalf of those fear to try to assuage them and address the problem. The problem is not so much Islam, but rather Islamism and radicalism. We haven't addressed those issues. Sadly, people are associating that form of particular ideological fascism with a religion, which is, in my mind, the wrong approach.
Give me your understanding of the main findings of this investigation.
Oh, I mean, for me, the way I understood it is it has everything has to do with the language. So again, it's about formulating a certain rhetoric and narrative and building, politics from that and deriving policies and trying again to address a certain audience without keeping in mind that Britain is a multicultural society. So it would be ridiculous to kind of isolate certain demographic on the basis that we disagree with them or don't understand them. And I think this is what the Conservatives have done so far. And I think this is what they're guilty of in the report, is to have isolated and, pointed out certain members of society and basically telling their demographic that those people are the enemy, they are the danger. And it has sipped through everything that they have done and said. And I think that to a great extent, I think Boris Johnson is still the victim, or maybe the architect of Trump's legacy, in the sense that he has carried on the same type of narrative, and this has sipped through the whole hierarchy of the Conservative Party. And I think that's the main problem. This is what is coming to light now with that report, is that it has to do with language, it has to do with behavior, it has to do with systematic prejudices against the Muslim community for the wrong reasons. If we were to talk against terrorism, obviously I would imagine that everybody would agree, but it's targeting a religion, a demographic, a particular segment of the population, not because they hold certain ideas, but because they are being misunderstood, and that's the problem. And again, they're trying to paint people under the same brush, which is very dangerous.
Baroness Varsi, who is a Conservative member of the House of Lords, says her own party is institutionally racist, which begs the question why she's still in it, but that's another matter. But should we conclude, if she's right, that there's no possibility of changing that within the party?
No, I disagree. I think she's being radical in her views. I mean, you can't. Again, we're talking about currents. We're not talking about. In my mind, it's like if you were to take people within the Conservative Party and isolate them from the whole, you would not. I don't believe that they're racist, and I don't think they're being Islamophobic per se. What I'm saying is that they're catering to a narrative that is Islamophobic because it makes sense politically for them. What we need to do is to change the dynamic and actually demonstrate that that kind of behavior, that kind of language is actually counterintuitive in terms of how do we go about solving the problem of Islamic radicalism, which is ultimately what we want to do. Now, again, to point the fingers at the Conservative Party as a whole and say they're all very, very bad, we can't engage with them, is just as radical as saying that, you know, we can't engage with Muslims full stop because this and this and this and this. So we need to kind of temper our passions here and not to try to play again into the whole political narrative saying that, you know, it's us versus them. It doesn't work out. Identity politics is a very dangerous game to play.
I mean, here's the problem here. How can the ruling Conservative Party tackle anti-Muslim prejudice in Britain when, according to this report, there's anti-Muslim prejudice in their own party?
I think they can. I think they can if they are willing to be held accountable for the kind of language that they have held themselves. I think they can change things if they decide to, again, to hold their hands up in the air and say, yes, we have been guilty of, to some degree, of racism, because it's easy to do things this way. We all have, by the way, because I think that when people are scared, they just go back to what is easy, which is to hate and to try to isolate, you know, the enemy, the so-called enemy. Look, the Conservative Party has been elected in power. We can't deny this. So that means that there is maybe a problem with Britain as a whole as well, not just the Conservative Party. It's just a reflection of. So we need to have, I think, like kind of a national conversation, maybe a little bit of self-reflection, and actually address again the real issue, because we never done that. It's always very superficial. You know, people say the problem is Islam. Is it really, or is it just radicalism? Is it just, or maybe it's not even radicalism, maybe it's fascism in general that we haven't actually addressed and understood properly as an ideology. So I think we need to be talking about that rather than just point fingers and say, well, they're bad. It doesn't help the conversation to say that someone is bad and then we stop there. We need to try to address the problem, because, you know, those issues are also, it's across other parties in the UK, maybe not just as bad, but, you know, fascism and this desire to isolate on identity politics is pandemic. It's something, you know, it's part of this woke parade that the left is guilty of as well. So it's not like the Labour Party is doesn't need to answer to a few, you know, to a few crimes. So let's just not just decide that the Conservative Party is really, really bad. I think that everyone has a lot answering to do right now in England, and not just about Islamophobia, but other issues as well that are related to fascism as well, in my mind.
Ahmed, you drew a dichotomy earlier between racism and religious hatred. Mm-hmm. And it's true, of course, that not all Muslims are people of colour, but most Muslims are in Britain. The overwhelming number of Muslims in this country are people of colour. Sikhs are regularly attacked because the criminal who's attacking them thinks they're Muslims. Mm. Isn't it the case that racism exists here and Islamophobia merely aggravates it?
Well, again, I'm wary about using the term Islamophobia, and I think part of what the lady was saying was that actually we need a different discourse, because it's all about pointing the finger and saying this one's the enemy and, you know, this is the one we have to watch out for. But I always remember the words of Sheikh Ahmed Thomson bin Umar, who's from Ghana originally, and I was at a talk he was giving many years ago now, and he said, I'm not going to talk to you about Islamophobia. I'm going to talk to you about Islamophobia. And you know, he has such a love for the Prophet and a love for the Deen of Islam in its fullest sense, that he completely changed the dialogue, if you like, changed the discourse to something positive. And this actually undermines then the techniques that are used to demonize the Muslims, including even the use of the term Islamophobia, which I never use myself. So I think this is what has to be done. And when you know, you've talked about the need to educate people. And I think part of education is saying, you know, we have to agree to disagree on some things, but many core values we do hold in common. And people talk about British values, but if they say it's going to the football match and getting drunk and then getting into a fight. That's not a British value. You know, that's another form of extremism.
It does happen, though.
It does happen, yeah. So all of these things that happen often kind of get parceled neatly into this pigeonhole or that pigeonhole. But I think actually people need to broaden their horizons and actually study what they're attacking, if they're attacking without even knowing what they're attacking, so that they know what is good in people and what is not so good in people. And hopefully, if inherently, if they have good hearts, they will gravitate towards what is good. There will always be people who gravitate towards what is bad. There will always be people who gravitate to extremism in all its manifestations. And for example, there's a very good book written by Sheikh Muhammad Al-Yaqubi, you know, who's a very knowledgeable scholar. I mean, you call me a scholar. He's a scholar. I'm not. You know, I'm like a beginner. And his book was called Refuting ISIS. And he said, well, let's look at what they say and what they do, and in the light of what actually the Quran says and what the Prophet is recorded as having said and acted. And his conclusion is these people are not Muslim. They've gone so far to extreme that they've gone out of the deen. And it's always horrific because people in the name of Islam kill people indiscriminately, as we saw with ISIS, as we saw with Al-Qaeda, as we saw with the Manchester bombing. Of course, when it comes to bombing Gaza and killing people there indiscriminately, no one says anything about that.
Except you and me.
Yeah.
And us here on Kalima Horra. I've been George Galloway. This has been a very free word, Kalima Horra. You've been a wonderful audience. Thanks for watching.